Picture Europe in the late 1930s, where Germany is gearing up for a kind of warfare the world has not seen before. Tanks, trucks, motorcycles, everything runs on fuel, and every second counts. That is when German engineers quietly built something so simple and so perfect that it became one of the most underrated inventions of the entire war. A steel fuel container that never leaked, never rusted, and could survive being dropped off a speeding truck. It did not look like much. 20 litres, 3 handles on top, and an odd X-shaped pattern stamped into both sides. But anyone who tested it realised instantly that this thing was not just tough, it was brilliant. Soldiers could carry it with one hand, or pass it between two people. The cap opened in seconds, and no matter what you put it through, whether freezing cold, desert heat, or explosions, the can held together. So when an American engineer managed to bring one of these cans back to the United States, you would think the army would have jumped on it right away. Instead, the opposite happened. America tried to copy the design, and somehow ended up ruining the very detail that made the original so smart. And the fallout from that mistake would hit them right where it hurt most, on the battlefield. But to understand how this happened, you need to know what made the German version nearly perfect in the first place. To see why this little steel container became legendary, you have to look at how the Germans built it from the ground up. They weren't trying to make a better gas can, they were trying to solve a survival problem. Their armies moved fast, sometimes faster than their supply lines could keep up. If fuel ran out, the entire offensive stalled, and in Germany's mind, that wasn't an option. So their engineers designed a can that could take abuse without failing. They welded the seams instead of folding them, which made the body airtight. They coated the inside so gasoline would not corrode the metal. They pressed that X-shaped pattern into the sides, not for decoration, but to keep the steel from warping when temperatures shifted. And the three-handle design? That was genius on its own. One person could carry it, or 2 soldiers could pass it hand to hand down a line like a relay. But listen to this. The Germans even tested the cans by throwing them off moving vehicles, freezing them solid, heating them in ovens, and smashing them with sledgehammers. If a can failed, it was redesigned until it did not. Nothing about the final product was an accident. This was not just a fuel container, it was a logistical weapon. Once you see how carefully it was engineered, it becomes even stranger that America got hold of this design and still managed to break it. Because what happened next makes the story take a sharp turn. Before the United States ever saw a German jerry can, American troops were stuck with fuel containers that felt like they came out of a hardware store instead of a military factory. They were tall, awkward, and built with a screw-top cap that loved to jam at the worst moments. The metal rusted quickly, especially in humid climates, and once rust formed, gasoline inside turned into a gritty mess that destroyed engines. Soldiers knew the cans were bad long before the army admitted it. They leaked when tossed into trucks. They dented so easily that even a small hit could knock the seal loose. When drivers rolled across deserts or rough terrain, the cans bounced around like tin toys, spilling precious fuel everywhere. But that was not the only problem. The narrow spout meant refueling took forever. In real combat, those minutes mattered. Slow refueling meant slow movement, and slow movement cost lives. Mechanics complained constantly, and officers wrote report after report begging for a redesigned can, anything that did not waste fuel or contaminate engines. By the time World War II was heating up, the United States was burning through millions of gallons every month. Losing even a fraction of that to leaks was not just annoying, it was dangerous. The Americans needed a miracle, and strangely enough, one was already on its way across the Atlantic. Because an American engineer had seen the German can up close. He knew it was the solution everyone was looking for. The turning point came thanks to an American engineer named Paul Pleiss. He had been working in Berlin before the war and saw the German jerry can everywhere, stacked in factories, tossed in trucks, dragged across concrete, and still coming out without a dent or a drop spilled. He realized immediately that this was not just a fuel container. It was a major engineering advantage. Pleiss understood how far behind the United States was in fuel logistics, so he did something bold. He gathered a few jerry cans, packed the manufacturing drawings, and secretly arranged transport back to the United States. Once he returned, he brought everything straight to the War Department, expecting the reaction to be something like, "Where has this been all our lives?" But that's not all. He did not just show them the can, he demonstrated how easy it was to open the cap with one motion. How 3 people could grab it at once, how the welded seams made leaks almost impossible. Every detail was meant to solve a real battlefield problem, and he laid it all out. The welded seams were a critical part of the design. The response he got wasn't just disappointing, it was shocking. The army did not accept the design. They did not even try to produce a test batch. Instead, they dismissed it as too complicated and not necessary. Officials insisted that American factories should build American designs, even if those designs were not working. Pleiss walked out of that meeting stunned. He had shown them a nearly perfect solution, and they had turned their backs on it out of pride. And this is where things start to unravel, because America did not stop at rejecting the German can. They tried to copy it anyway, and that is when everything went downhill. Once the army realized they couldn't ignore the German design forever, they tried to create their own version. On paper, it sounded simple: copy the jerry can, tweak it a little, and make it American. But instead of improving anything, the redesign stripped out the very detail that made the original so reliable. The first thing engineers removed was the internal lining. The German can had a special coating that kept gasoline from eating through the metal. Without it, the American version rusted from the inside out. Tiny flakes of metal mixed into the fuel, and engines started choking on contaminated gas. Mechanics knew it immediately. Something was wrong. But it gets worse. Instead of keeping the cam lever cap that opened instantly and sealed tight, US designers switched to a threaded screw cap. It clogged easily, collected dirt, and took longer to open. Soldiers hated it. In the field, speed mattered, not paperwork-friendly design. They also changed the steel, used weaker seams, and pressed the body differently. The X-shaped indentation became shallow, almost decorative, instead of acting as real reinforcement. That meant more dents, more warping, and more leaks. All of this was done in the name of simplifying production, but every shortcut created a new headache. The final product looked like a jerry can, but it didn't act like one. It certainly didn't survive like one. And the result hit the front lines fast. Fuel started disappearing, engines malfunctioned, and the Allies discovered they had copied a masterpiece in the most careless way possible. But the real fallout showed up on the battlefield, where these choices became impossible to hide. Once the American redesign hit the front lines, the problems showed up almost immediately. In North Africa, where temperatures cooked metal like an oven, US fuel cans expanded, warped, and split open at the seams. Drivers opened truck beds, only to find puddles of gasoline soaking through the canvas, evaporating into the desert air. Every gallon lost meant less mobility, fewer options, and more risk. Troops started noticing that even when a can looked fine on the outside, rust flakes were breaking loose inside. Engines sputtered, stalled, or died altogether. Mechanics spent hours cleaning carburetors and fuel lines that should not have been dirty in the first place. The German army did not have this issue. Their cans protected the fuel. America's cans ruined it. But it gets crazier. Soldiers began trading for German jerry cans whenever they found abandoned vehicles or captured supply dumps. They did not care where the cans came from. They cared that they worked. Entire units quietly preferred using enemy fuel containers because their own equipment could not be trusted. The waste was staggering. By mid-war, the Allies were losing millions of gallons to spills, leaks, and contamination. And during campaigns where fuel meant victory, those losses did not just slow things down, they reshaped entire operations. Officers filed report after report begging for a redesign, warning that the American version was failing at a scale no one wanted to admit. The truth was simple: the Germans had built a nearly perfect tool, and the US had broken it without understanding what they were changing. And the irony is that eventually the truth became too big to ignore, forcing America to face the very design they once rejected. As the war dragged on, complaints from the front lines piled so high that Washington could not pretend everything was fine anymore. Fuel losses were impossible to hide, and maintenance crews were drowning in avoidable repairs. It became clear that the American version of the jerry can was not just inconvenient, it was a liability. Internal reports started circulating, quietly comparing the American can to the German original. The findings were embarrassing. The German design lasted longer, held pressure better, resisted corrosion, and survived conditions that tore the US version apart. Officers even documented how soldiers were hunting down German cans because they trusted them more, but that's not all. Behind the scenes, manufacturing officers finally admitted what no one wanted to say publicly. The Germans had built a superior product, and the only way forward was to mimic it more closely. Factories were instructed to adjust the shape, reinforce the seams, and move back towards something closer to the original design that Pleiss had brought home years earlier. It was not a perfect match, but it was a step toward reality. The army never made a big announcement about the change. They could not. Admitting that a rejected enemy design had become the template for their own fuel system would have been a political nightmare. Instead, the upgrades slipped into production quietly, piece by piece. Even after the war, the story stuck. Countries everywhere kept using the German-style jerry can, and it became the global standard for decades. Meanwhile, America's early redesign was remembered mostly as a warning: you cannot cut corners on something built to survive war. And that brings us to the final takeaway, a moment that ties together pride, engineering, and one tiny detail that changed everything. When you look back at the whole story, it is almost hard to believe a simple fuel can could shape mobility, strategy, and survival on the battlefield. Germany built theirs with precision, intention, and an understanding that every inch of metal had a purpose. America tried to follow that blueprint, but one missing detail, that protective interior lining, turned a brilliant design into a constant problem. But here is the part people miss. This was not just about fuel cans. It was about what happens when pride outruns practicality. Pleiss handed the army a proven solution, and they brushed it off. That one decision cost millions of gallons, countless hours of repairs, and put soldiers at unnecessary risk. And even though the United States eventually corrected course, the lesson lingered long after the war ended. The German jerry can became a worldwide standard, not because it looked good, but because every feature served a purpose. And the fact that America ignored the most important one shows how easy it is to break something perfect when you do not understand why it works. It makes you wonder how different things might have been if they had listened the first time, and how many other great ideas have been lost the same way.